Hello, welcome to this special episode of the Public Works Podcast. I'm your host for today's show, Shane Silsby. And as you can see, I'm down at Washington, D.C. Central, outside the U.S. Capitol building, to talk about the episode today with the Road Gang, which is an industry association group that works in the D.C. area on transportation issues primarily, but infrastructure issues, and tries to figure out what's going on with Congress, which is right down this way for the congressional buildings, and on the House side, and the Senate, which is over this way for the Senate side, the President, which is down this way towards Pennsylvania Avenue, and of course the Capitol, where the legislators debate what bills will become a law. We had guests Nathan Macek today, who is the current chair of the Road Gang, and Susan Binder, who's the past chair from 2025 for the Road Gang, and we discussed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, what went good, what could have been improved. We look ahead to the next potential infrastructure or surface transportation bill, which would need to be in place by the end of this fiscal year, which is September 30th. So we talk about the trends, positively or negatively on that happening, what it could look like, funding levels, categories, things like that. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy this special episode from downtown Washington, D.C. Thanks. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Public Works Podcast. This is a special edition. We're in downtown Washington, D.C. right now. I've been here advocating on Capitol Hill, but there's another group that does good work here in D.C. regularly, and that is a group, a society, an association, an entity called the Road Gang, which is interesting, as I wanted to hear more about that. So we have some special guests here today. Susan Binder, Vice President of Federal Transportation Market and Policy for Cambridge Systematics. Nathan Macek, who is a VP also, but the Infrastructure Finance Director for HDR. Both are in the DC area and work generally here and meet with folks in the area. So welcome, Nate and Susan, to the show.
Thank you.
Appreciate you being here. We're going to share mics today just so you can hear us at home. Between the two of you, could you talk a little bit about the Road Gang and how that got started, the intention of that? Obviously, it's a very old organization as I looked into it, but maybe Nate, you want to give us a little background on that?
Yeah, Road Gang dates to 1942, so we're about an 84-year-old organization. It was founded by people who were interested in highway issues and worked for what was the predecessor of the U.S. Department of Transportation, Bureau of Public Roads, and other agencies at the time, and they wanted to share information about engineering and design and funding and other issues associated with building highway systems across the U.S. And the organization has evolved over time. Today, we continue to talk about surface transportation issues generally. So that includes highway, transit, rail. Sometimes we will venture a little bit beyond that to other transportation modes as well. But because everything is so multimodal today, we're not just about roads anymore, but continue to maintain that name of the Road Gang. We have a variety of speakers. Our format is that we have a luncheon every month, and we typically have a speaker at that lunch who talks about a topical issue for transportation practitioners. So our last luncheon, we had the Federal Highway Administrator, Sean McMaster, come. Next month in April, we're going to have Katie Thompson, the Acting Secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation. In May, we're actually going to be doing a tour of the Turner Fairbanks Highway Research Center in McLean, Virginia, which will be a neat trip. In June, we're going to hear from the Virginia Transportation Secretary. And to provide an example of another topic, when we don't have an agency head speaking, we had a panel on the state of buses in our region and had people from the Department of Rail and Public Transportation in Virginia, Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and Metro, our transit system here in DC, talking about some initiatives they have regarding bus. So it's always a variety of topics, a variety of interesting people. We have a little bit of a social period before we have lunch, and then we hear from our speaker. We have Q&A. Our events are always off the record, as we say, so that our speakers have the flexibility to speak as they wish, and a good organization for networking and for learning and keeping in touch with transportation issues.
That's great. Anything you want to add on that, Susan?
I think Nate really covered it, but in many respects, what I really enjoy about Road Gang is that it's an opportunity not only for networking, but for bringing in people from a very diverse set of perspectives, public sector, private sector, local, because we are in DC. We really do try to focus on DC, Virginia, and Maryland at both the state DOT level and these transit agencies and even departments of public works in those communities. It's a really great way to, in a more candid and informal way, meet with people that we often in this day and age meet on Zoom, but we don't see in person. I remember when I first joined a road gang, which was many years ago. We were down at the waterfront in DC at Channel Inn. We were thought of as the highway lobby. And in a way, the focus on Congress and the administration is still there, but we've really broadened it because the interests are wider than that. But we're a pretty astute group and have some good questions and hard-hitting conversation. And so it makes it a really worthwhile use of our luncheons.
That's great. I want to stay with you for a minute. I found some comfort knowing that you have a group of smart, forward-focused people thinking about these issues, transportation infrastructure in DC, where the money generally flows from. So that just gave me some comfort. But you all are great people, so I want to talk to you about your journey, how you got to this point. You have a great experience. So Susan, if you wouldn't mind highlighting how you got to this point.
Sure. I did not take a predictable path in my career. Transportation was never on my list of career paths. I really started in textile engineering, which I see is as close to engineering as I got educationally, and consumer economics. But through a variety of experiences at the Consumer Product Safety Commission, at the Department of Labor, I found my way to transportation through essentially a management intern program and really recognized how important transportation is to our daily lives. It's really a kitchen table issue in its fullest sense. I joined USDOT and applied those economic skills and those program management skills and worked in headquarters. One of my best jobs was to be division administrator for Federal Highway for the state of Maryland. So I ran the program for the federal agency for the state of Maryland. I also got the opportunity to work on Capitol Hill. Since that time, when I retired from the agency, I did work in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee in its own right, and now I'm in consulting at Cambridge Systematics. So I've been in the public sector, the private sector, the executive branch, the legislative branch. I've worked for Republicans, I've worked for Democrats, OMB. It's been quite a journey when I look back at it. But I think that combination of perspectives and education has really served me well, and it's a little hard to let go. I'm still in it.
That's great. As we move to Nate, just a couple of pieces there from a funding perspective, so important. So for the listeners, Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is the Senate side that creates the infrastructure bills or surface transportation bills, funding amounts, categories, all those details. And then on the House side, we have the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and then they come together to form the final bill. But once that gets approved, then it still needs to get funded through appropriations. And you mentioned OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, that then actually administers the funds after the appropriations. So you've been involved in all that, which is great. You can see it from all sides. And now you get to work with Nate. So Nate, let's hear about your career journey, how you made it to this point.
Yeah, I have a degree in political economy from Michigan State, Spartans.
Yeah.
Then went directly to grad school. I have a degree in Master's of Regional Planning from University of North Carolina. And when I got to the end of grad school, I sort of had this moment of, oh, now I need to go to work. What do I want to do for a job? Now, and I thought about law school for a while. And I was like, you know what? I've been in school direct for so many years. I need to go get a job. Having had a planning degree, I found my way into consulting, where it brought together some of the analytical capabilities from an undergrad degree with some of the planning-oriented issues that we deal with within the transportation field, and found that I really enjoyed financial planning, and have been working for the last 25 years here in DC with different firms prior to HDR, and now the last 5 years with HDR, doing basically financial planning for transportation projects. My clients are state DOTs or departments of transportation, transit agencies, metropolitan planning organizations, sometimes federal agencies. We're looking in the work that I do and that my team does is helping our clients to identify the funding and financing they need to make their projects possible. I found that it was a good marriage of my academic interests and my personal interests. When I was a kid, I used to love to cut trails in the woods around our house and would make my own highway signs as guide signs out there. So I guess I had a natural affinity for transportation issues as a kid, and it's been a really fulfilling career.
Oh, that's great. And I know you've helped out a number of agencies with federal grants too, and that across the board, multiple categories. That brings me to my next question about federal funding and infrastructure. And with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we refer to as IIJA, it's about a 60-40 split, 60% formulaic dollars, 40% grants. That's why I think Nate and others are doing a lot of work on that side to try to help agencies with all those categories. But can you all talk about your perspectives with IIJA? Obviously, it was historical levels of funding in certain categories, and we are now in the fifth year of 5. And my experience is the fifth year has been a little bit challenging, but I want to hear from you all, and then how you think, was it effective? We needed more, obviously, or we need to tweak some things at administration, but we're going to look forward to the next bill. So I just want to get your thoughts on IIJA at this point.
I could start, and I know we both have strong opinions about this because we work so closely with it. Overall, it's been effective and has, I think the big difference that it's made is to add additional funding for infrastructure investment. And we know we're here and ASCE is meeting, and a year ago came out with its infrastructure report card. So we know that we have a need for investment in transportation and other infrastructure categories, and the IIJA delivered in that regard by providing more funding for that. And I think novelly, I think the big innovation in the IIJA was the advance appropriation, so that a large percentage of the funds were appropriated in advance rather than requiring congressional action on an annual basis. So we always did have that on the highway side with the contract authority that existed for the funding that goes through state DOTs for highway programs. We didn't necessarily have that for transit or for rail programs, and they were always subject to the annual appropriation cycle. That provided some steadiness to the program, I think, especially when the new administration took office a year ago and they were looking to head in a different direction, and at least provided some inertia to the program where some of the funds continued to flow through those advance appropriations. There wasn't the sort of, is it going to get appropriated or not? There was some of that because some of it was still subject to annual appropriations, but the spigot continued to flow for a lot of it because it was advance appropriated. I think the big question is whether they'll do that again this next time around, because that was a very novel approach. And we're even looking at, is the IIJA, is the surface transportation bill going to get passed in time for the September deadline? The current outlook on that is probably not, given everything that Congress has on its calendar. So we're looking at an extension, and they'll be extending the authorization, but probably not that advance appropriation. So we're going to be back to annual appropriations for the programs then that are under that. And I think, too, it's helpful to think about what's the difference between an authorization and an appropriation. And the way I always explain it to people is the authorization is sort of like an envelope. It's how much you can fit in and spend it the most. And the appropriation is like the cash you actually put in the envelope. And that cash can't exceed the size of the envelope, generally speaking, but you don't have to put the full amount of cash in the envelope, and you don't even have to put any cash in the envelope if Congress so chooses when they appropriate annually. So the two together work to define how much money you have. And I think a lot of people have been thinking with surface transportation, our level's going to drop to where they were pre-IIJA, or our level's going to remain steady. I hold my hat on the fact that Congress has never gone backwards from one surface transportation reauthorization to the next. So I think where we are in this fifth year is probably where at least we start from next time around. But how much more than that it'll be, I don't know. That'll be what'll be interesting to see when a bill comes out.
Susan, your thoughts on IIJA? Good, bad, ugly, pretty?
Well, my perspective on IIJA is really born from my longstanding involvement with the development of reauthorization from both an administrative perspective, program delivery. I have been at the forefront of the actual boots on the ground, getting the projects delivered, programs delivered from the executive branch point of view, but also from the legislative. I ran congressional affairs for a period at Federal Highway, but that was building on my really great experience in ICE-T. I was a Legis Fellow, so I worked within the T&I committee, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, the House Authorizing Committee for that landmark piece of legislation. I worked on reauthorizations since the 1974 Act amendments. In any case, my perspective on authorizations really is honed by the fact that questions of federal role and program structure and eligibilities and all these relatively mundane pieces all have to be pulled together. And it's a good news thing that we have comprehensive legislation every so many years. And by the way, there's nothing magic about 4 years or 6 years. For many years, the interstate was run, a huge program with 2-year authorizations, but the expectation was that, like clockwork, they would resume at the end of each 2-year cycle. These pieces of authorization, instead of having the kind of legislation that other functional areas are subject to, which you can have a provision any given time, here they have to fit together. And there is some rigor associated with the trains leaving town for a few more years, and it's got to come together. And we're fond of saying it ain't over till it's all over. So you have all these different pieces that have to fit together. IIJA didn't come about in that same way. It was not prepared in what we would call regular order. It was very difficult. If our listeners remember that there was a lot of challenge in getting an infrastructure bill together, and some thought it wouldn't happen, but ultimately members swept in, not staff, members swept in, and they took bits and pieces of the Senate bill that had been passed and the House bill that had been passed and did a sort of a do-over, which made it very hard to actually execute. It was a bit of a sloppy bill from the point of view of a legislative analyst, but it had some things in it that were really different. For one thing, the definition of infrastructure was much bigger scope than we were used to in a traditional highway or surface transportation bill. And the other thing is that in doing so, it acknowledged broadband and more green policy motivations. That is something that we will see whether we will revert to the more traditional scope of highways and transit in this piece of legislation. Yes, with every cycle, there are the naysayers who say that we're not going to get it done, we're going to have extensions. I have to tell you, I've written more extension language than I care to admit, but that's really not a big issue. I'm a Pollyanna. I think that this law will be written in this Congress. I think the motivation is there, and it's all about leadership. We have leadership in these committees right now who are absolutely dedicated to getting another bill. Now, one of the things that Nate mentioned here was the difference between authorizations and appropriations. And I tell my clients, Cambridge Systematics works with many DOTs, many MPOs to do the kind of long-range planning, safety planning, freight planning that is really a very important byproduct of the federal rules and regulations. In any case, the idea being that contract authority, this is a special type of budget authority that means that those programs that have the benefit of being funded by the Highway Trust Fund do not have to have that two-step process. They didn't have to have that workaround for advance appropriations, because when there is an authorization, you can proceed to obligation, which is the use of those funds, without the benefit of an appropriation act. This is why these authorizing committees are so important, and the reason why this kind of legislation is so important. I would point out that a real focus of my career has been on that contract authority, on the Highway Trust Fund, and this is going to be a pivotal issue in this cycle. Can we find the political will to make sure that the Highway Trust Fund not only is not insolvent, because technically it can't be insolvent, but that it can support the kind of baseline levels that Nate was referring to? All of the interest groups really want to keep these levels. But the Highway Trust Fund cannot support that at this point, and they've been relying on moving funds from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund. And I'm not sure that the political climate is there to continue to do that.
Can I ask you all to talk about that as we wrap IIJA and we look ahead to the next bill? The reason why we need these general fund allocations in to support transportation. You mentioned potential insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund, but can you explain why that is for our listeners, the gas tax issue, all of that?
I'll pass the mic to Nate, but to start with, really, the federal programs have been so successful that they've created an appetite that goes beyond what the combination of different user fees that are dedicated to the Highway Trust Fund at the federal level can support. Over time, these taxes, and with travel, with driving increasing, think about the demographics, growth, two-car households, etc. More and more travel gave us the luxury of having more and more funds going into the trust fund. We, in effect, were a victim of our own success. We then had more money to spend, and therefore more programs that were determined to be worthy of funding. Now, the rate of growth, the demand may be there, but the revenues that are coming into the trust fund have slowed down. The latest numbers are showing that they'll be stable, but not enough to compensate. And I would not blame this completely on the EVs. Some people find them to be the easy villain in this, but in many respects, it's the good news that internal combustion engines are more fuel efficient. And as a result, we are not getting revenues at the same rate as we are spending. It's just that simple.
Okay.
And I think there's one other factor too on the federal side, which is that the rate hasn't changed either in more than 30 years. And so, you still pay the same, 37.5 cents per gallon that you did in 1992. So even though the price of gas back then was around $1 a gallon, the last few years it's been in the $3 range in a lot of the country. Now it's growing higher than that with current world events. But that rate of taxation at the federal level has remained fixed. Most states have actually raised their rates in the meantime. And some speculated and said maybe that should reflect a shift over time from a federal role to a state role. But I think because the feds have always found a way to backstop that dilution of the Highway Trust Fund with general fund monies or funds found elsewhere, we haven't seen that devolution occur because the federal funds have always been shored up in some way. And that'll be a key thing to see with this particular bill. What is the pay for? Where do they get the funds to? Susan's right. You would have to identify additional funds from the general fund or other sources in order to make up for what the Highway Trust Fund doesn't generate for the spending levels that are authorized. You mentioned EVs, and that's one of the things that I thought was interesting when the budget reconciliation bill was being considered a year ago, which was passed and is known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which had tax reform and a lot of other components to it. But one of the proposals for that bill was to impose a federal fee on EVs and hybrid vehicles. For sort of technical reasons, that was ruled as something that couldn't be part of the Senate bill. I think that we're probably likely to see some form of that fee come back in a reauthorization proposal as a way of potentially providing a new funding source for the Highway Trust Fund. And it's a novel approach, in part because it is a federal requirement. The way it was worded a year ago, and if they were to do something similar with the authorization bill, it was a federal requirement that the states had to implement, and basically would be an additional fee that would be tacked on at vehicle registration by a Department of Motor Vehicles agency. That would be on top of whatever you might pay for your vehicle registration at the state level. So in Virginia, if you have a fuel efficient vehicle, you pay not just your regular registration fee, but we also have what's called a highway use fee in Virginia, which is basically computed based on the difference between what you might spend in fuel taxes and what you actually spend in fuel taxes, given that you have a fuel efficient vehicle. The interesting thing about the way the Virginia law is written is that it applies regardless of whether you have an EV or hybrid. It's sort of agnostic as to propulsion technology. I don't pay it on my plug-in EV because its fuel efficiency threshold is not high enough to require paying that fee. I do pay it on my 10-year-old Mazda 3, which just happens to be a high efficiency vehicle, but is not hybrid or not a EV, but applies in that sense. So there are some interesting things happening in the states with this. And it'll be interesting to see if the feds use the opportunity to create some sort of structure that allows a revenue mechanism for these and hybrids and other fuel efficient vehicles that are not paying as much on average as a conventional propulsion vehicle on average.
Interesting. One could argue that will be an increasing percentage of the challenge, where you have people using the roadways but not paying into that system. But a user pay system, I think, would be a nonpartisan or a bipartisan issue to have users pay. But it seems that Congress is just looking past the big issue, which you brought up a little bit, Nate, which is the federal gas tax not being adjusted since 1992. Think about anything you do in your lives or any bills you pay, they're increasing year over year. Think about not having an adjustment to your revenue over 30 years. And if that were to happen, nobody wants to raise a tax on either side, but maybe called a tariff, and people would love that now. But if that were to happen, even to some extent, then you could increase the levels of the Highway Trust Fund, not have to bring money over from the general fund and have all the machinations of the politics. And maybe back to your point, Susan, then you wouldn't need that second level because the source is direct and you can just go from there and appropriate. Or do I have that all wrong? Tell me.
I think what you put your finger on is that there is a reckoning that is going to be happening. How many more times can we kick the can down the road on this issue? And my sense is that this is part of what is so difficult for the Congress to grapple with, because the competing tensions are to support levels of investment that allow us to keep up with preservation of our system, to adopt new technologies. They're not static. People have also gotten to understand how the importance, there was a period in which we talked about commuting only and freight don't vote. Well, I think all we had to have was the pandemic and the public become aware of supply chain issues when they become more sensitized. So you have this strong appetite, and people recognize that economic vitality and personal mobility is so dependent upon a well-functioning, designed national transportation system, which we have an understanding in this country about federalism, that the feds don't do it all, but it is important that the states and locals do this in collaboration so that it's a system. That's sort of the backdrop. That realization is very important when you are trying to figure out what are the levels of funding can you support and must you support. Having said that, the recent legislation, last couple of rounds, have included various pilot programs for road user charging programs. They're called a variety of things: VMT, mileage-based user fees, road user charging. But the bottom line is adhering to the user fee principle, which I think many of us really endorse. It's a compact. As I was executive director of a commission, a National Surface Transportation Policy Revenue Study Commission, and we talked about the compact that was between the American public and the government with the idea that we all were in this together and we needed to pay for the facilities that were important for us to have. So that use fee principle is something that very few of us, besides the elements of contract authority, which require a user fee of a highway trust fund, at least 90% user fee supported. This is really part of fairness. When you have all different kinds of fuels now, are these different variation in the fuels, is that questioning the fairness. That's why the concept of road user charging VMT fees is so attractive, and it has been tested in many states right now. Some states like Virginia have incorporated it, as you said, into the registration fees, and I think that these hold the answer to the problem. A gasoline tax, a diesel tax was a rough approximation for many years, but now that linkage is breaking. It is not nearly as good. Will the Congress have the will to adopt these new approaches? That's why we wrote the pilot programs when I was in the Senate to test these. And again, is it political will, which seems to be difficult to organize in terms of increasing the rate or even indexing the rate? Will they have the political will to take the steps to move from pilot to real programs? And I have to say that the states, the concept of the laboratory of the states, really is working. They are working out the kinks in this system, and a national advisory board, which has never been fully convened to take this to a national level, is really part of the answer. I know that Chairman Graves is very interested in this concept. Can he make this a reality?
That's going to be interesting, and I want to wrap our discussion today with getting your perspectives on the next infrastructure bill. And in my experience with IIJA, originally the needs assessment was about $3 trillion. The initial drafts were like 2-ish trillion, and it ends up at 1.2 trillion for other categories, including water and things like that. As we look forward to the next potential bill, your thoughts on, will it be more traditional infrastructure or be comprehensive? What levels might we see? I think, Nate, you already said there might be some pessimism whether that could actually get done this cycle. So just maybe your thoughts on the next infrastructure or surface transportation bill.
So I think the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and we already talked about the fact that it had a wide variety of infrastructure categories that were part of the definition of it. And it happened to include the surface transportation bill as part of it. I think what we're talking about here is really more of a traditional surface bill that's just focused on transportation infrastructure. I mean, we'll see when we finally get a draft of what they propose, but I don't have the sense that the other non-transportation infrastructure categories that were looped into that broader bill are part of what we'll see come around this time. Because those were there was this combination of sort of one-off programs and an authorization that was happening at the same time in the same bill. And I think what we're more focused on, and if you look at the committees that are involved in putting a bill together, it's more directly focused on transportation. Everybody's talking about transportation. Some are even using sort of what I think is a little bit archaic terminology to refer to it as a highway bill, because at least the last 40 years, it's been really a surface transportation bill inclusive of transit, and now more recently even railroad as well. I think it will be broadly focused on surface transportation, but not the other modes, or the other infrastructure categories, I should say. The other thing that I would expect, funding level will be a big question here. I think folks are looking for some simplicity with respect to how the funds are bracketed, in part, I think, because of sort of the composite approach to putting the bill together that Susan described. You wound up with a lot of different funding pots and a lot of different grant programs that people had to apply for, and individual projects might qualify for 5 or 6 different categories of grant funding, but you have to do different application cycles for each of those. And we've seen some weariness of that with some agencies who would like to see more of the funds go out by formula and less discretionary. Personally, I think there's still going to be a role for discretionary, because that can reach some infrastructure owners that are not receiving the funds directly through formula. So the state DOTs love formula because most of the funds flow through them and then out to their states. But I think if you're a city or county government, you like your opportunity to be able to go directly to the feds at times. And I think Congress likes the discretionary approach too, because that's a way for them to have more of an imprint than everything by formulas. I think maybe there'll be some consolidation of discretionary pots, maybe more funding going out by formula than by discretionary. But I don't see an end to discretionary programs generally, because I think that there's a need for it in certain sectors. And there's also some discretionary programs that account for the fact that infrastructure needs have a lumpiness across the country. So not everybody has major bridges that they need to repair in the same way that you do across the Ohio River at Cincinnati with the Brent Spence Bridge, for example. Not every state has major seaports that require investment that you see through the Port Infrastructure and Development Program. Not every state has major transit programs that require funding through programs like the Capital Investment Grants Program through Federal Transit Administration. So because those assets are unevenly distributed across the country, it wouldn't make sense to distribute by formula, because certain places are going to need funds for those needs and others aren't. My point is that there'll continue to be a role for discretionary, but I think that there'll be some reforms to simplify it quite a bit.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is that, and as I tell my students, I teach transportation funding and financing at the Minetta Transportation Institute. These issues, these tensions between what's the distribution to states versus to locals, transit, highway. I mean, we in the transportation arena tend to have silos. As we mature as a community, as an industry, we realize that those barriers are counterproductive and we need to be thinking them in a more integrated fashion. But often the funding categories don't catch up with that reality. So the tensions that are normal and natural, what for its time, for the moment, is the right distribution across states. After all, these programs are redistributive in nature. As you're saying, Nate, the needs are not even. Acknowledging what is the right distribution, what is the right share, what is the right way to frame local, state, and federal roles. Those are the things that we struggle with in putting those pieces of legislation together, and they may change. There is nothing perfect with the way that in any particular era it is. A friend of mine coined a term that I realize these are not solved, they are resolved for the time. And that was really a deferred conversation during IIJA. I think now that issue is really coming to light as well. The Basics Act was a proposal that has recently surfaced in the Congress that highlights that debate, not so much to reduce the total amount that goes for transportation, but what should be the share and where is the capacity to implement. That was one of the big questions in terms of discretionary grants. Who has the capacity to implement those dollars? Yes, it's important to get the dollars dedicated, but who can actually execute and use them? And again, with maturity and best practices, this will resolve itself over time, but it'll be very interesting to see how the Congress resolves those issues in this cycle.
I'm glad that I think both of you will be out there trying to help inform them on some options. I agree with you all that I see maybe more of a shift to the formulaic. I do worry that my clients are mostly cities and counties, and that process usually leaves out many of those communities when all of those communities pay into the tax system, both through the general fund side and the user fee side. My proposal to you all, you're all smart people, convert it all to formulaic if you want, but require sub-allocations to the lowest denominator, city, county, agency based on population, and then allow them to wash that maybe with a federal exchange so that those smaller agencies can get those converted to local dollars and maybe give the federal allocations to bigger agencies or whatever the case might be that are doing a bigger project. If you could do that, I think then people would be okay with a shift to formulaic because at least they could plan that they would receive some funds. Very difficult in the discretionary side to plan because you're rolling the dice. You don't know.
Yeah.
But also, it's your only opportunity sometimes as a local agency to try to achieve federal dollars.
Yeah.
You all are doing a great job. It gives me comfort to know you're out there having those discussions and making that happen. Appreciate your time today on the show. And maybe, Nate, I can just ask you, where can people find out more about the Road Gang or to find you all?
We have a website, roadgang.org. Folks can search us up on Google and check us out. You can sign up if you're local to the Washington, D.C. region. We have a newsletter you can sign up for, and it announces every event that we have. We also have our annual luncheon. Our annual meeting is always in conjunction with the Transportation Research Board meeting here in DC. We get a lot of folks who are friends of the Road Gang, who are from other parts of the country, who plan to join us Thursday of TRB week for our annual meeting. So would encourage anybody to join our mailing list. And if you're so inclined, our membership is only $75 a year. It's the best deal in town. And we're always happy to have more join us.
That's great. Thank you today for being on the show, Nathan Macek, Susan Binder. Appreciate your efforts. And to our listeners, I've been your host today, Shane Silsby, for this special edition of the Public Works Podcast with the Road Gang in downtown Washington, D.C. See you next time. All right. Here we are.
Joseph here, Public Works Podcast.
Shane here as well.
All right, so you just watched some cool content. All we need from you is to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps us get the message out. It helps us propagate the gospel of Public Works. So if you have free time, which you probably have 2 or 3 seconds, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button so more people can follow us.
That's right. All we're trying to do is highlight the public works industry.
That's it.
Make those professionals trying to improve your communities look good and raise awareness and credibility of public works.
Yes.
It's easy to do.
Once again, thanks for watching. If you have any content ideas, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments, and Shane or I will answer them within a week of you putting it in there, and we'll get you the answer that you need.
Thank you very much.